I am delighted to welcome Professor John Cottingham, who's our speaker tonight. He has so many achievements and honours that I had to make a list, not to confuse them all. Professor Cottingham is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Reading, a professorial research fellow at Heathrow College, University of London, visiting professor at King's College London, and an honorary fellow at St John's College, Oxford, just across the street from us now. He has served as president of the Aristotelian Society, the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, the Mind Association, and as a chairman of the British Society for the History of Philosophy. He is the author of many books and articles on early modern philosophy, and he has introduced, among other very important insights, trialism as an alternative interpretation of the mind-body dualism in Descartes. And more recently, he has also published on modern ethics and philosophy of religion. His most recent books are How to Believe and Philosophy of Religion Towards a More Humane Approach. And here at the Humane Philosophy Project, we're very happy that Professor Cottingham continues to use the idea of the humane approach or humane philosophy, because indeed the project takes its name from an article that Professor Cottingham wrote several years ago. What is humane philosophy and why it is at risk? And today Professor Cottingham is going to speak about morality and the transcendent. So please give him a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for those kind words. I'd like to thank Ralph and Nicola for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. Everyone has a handout, just some quotations, really. But it also indicates the 7 sections of the paper at the top, in italics there. So, ethics is transcendental. Wittgenstein says this in the closing pages of the Tractatus, his early masterpiece. What does he mean by calling ethics transcendental? The immediate context, of course, is the austere theory of language he's advancing in the Tractatus. The famous opening sentence says, "The world is everything that is the case," and what is the case, according to the account Wittgenstein goes on to give, is simply what can be stated in the atomic sentences specifying simple empirical states of affairs, or what can be reduced to those statements. So the aim of the Tractatus, as Wittgenstein said, is to set limits to the expression of thoughts, and it's only in language that those limits can be set. So, quote, "what lies at the other side of the limit will simply be nonsense." The job of language is to represent the world as a picture represents its object, and it follows that what can properly be said or asserted are only the empirical propositions of natural science. Whenever someone wants to go beyond that, the correct method is, in philosophy, is to show him that he's failed to give a meaning to certain signs in his propositions. I mean, that's familiar enough, and seems in some ways to prefigure the views of the logical positivists, who were to dismiss ethics along with aesthetic and religious language as incapable of verification and therefore nonsense. But Wittgenstein's position, I think it's clear, is much more delicate and interesting than this. In the closing sections of the Tractatus, he talks about the mystical, das Mystische, and he goes on to mention some of the ideas traditionally associated with religion and morality, God, death, the meaning of life. And we're left with the famous thought that what cannot be put into words can somehow perhaps make itself manifest or be show itself, even though it can't be said. Wittgenstein doesn't explicitly put it this way, but his position leaves room for the idea that ethics and religion, though there may be nonsense in the strict sense laid down by a science-based theory of language, might nevertheless be important, even illuminating, but they're things that can be shown even though they can't strictly be said. Now, Wittgenstein, I think, clearly retained a reverence for, certainly a respect, perhaps even a reverence for the domain of the mystical. And as far as religion is concerned, I think his position doesn't call to mind so much the steamroller of positivism as it developed in the 1930s, but rather the ancient apophatic tradition in Jewish and Christian religious thought, according to which our speech breaks down in the face of the unknowability of God, falling infinitely short of the mark, as Dennis Turner has put it. Now, in lectures given a bit later than the Tractatus, about 10 years after its publication, Wittgenstein returned to the domain of ethics, the realm he had called transcendental at the end of the Tractatus, and he used a striking image which many of you will know. This is quotation A on the sheet. Our words, this is to convey the inadequacy of language in this context. Our words, used as we use them in science, are vessels capable of only containing and conveying meaning and sense, natural meaning and sense. Ethics, if it's anything, is supernatural, and our words will only express facts as a teacup will only hold a cup full of water, even if I were to pour out a gallon over it. It's a nice image, but clearly we need to probe it further. I think we've got three labels in play so far in the passages I've mentioned: the mystical, the transcendent, or the transcendental. I think for this particular context, those two are virtually interchangeable, though clearly there are other philosophical contexts where they're not. And thirdly, the supernatural. Supernatural. But now, why should anyone think that any of those notions apply to ethics or morality? Well, it's clear, I think, that if you have an empirical, scientifically modelled template for language, restricted to what is the case, then religious language and ethical language, let's just think about ethical language for the moment, doesn't fit onto that template. It transcends it in the strict etymological sense of goes beyond it. You can't pour it into that particular cup. But that's a fairly modest sense of transcendent. To say ethical or moral language outruns the language of simple empirical depiction wouldn't make it transcendent in any deeper or more profound sense. The kind of sense Wittgenstein hints at by associating it with the mystical and the supernatural. And I want to suggest in this paper that ethics is indeed transcendent in this deeper or more profound sense that he may have been hinting at. But first I want to take a look at more modest accounts of the ethical, beginning with some reductionist accounts, what you might call very much non-transcendent, and then go on to look at some others which are also non-transcendent. You might call them immanentist accounts. So this is familiar territory, so I'll skim over it quite quickly, so-called Projectivism and its pitfalls. Now, Projectivism and similar views start from the idea that there can be plenty of legitimate roles for language other than simply depicting facts. And of course, that's a view Wittgenstein came to in his later work in the investigations. He came to think language is not limited to picturing. It's like a toolkit used for all sorts of, containing things that are used for all sorts of purposes. Now, much of the 20th century many moral philosophers held that ethical language doesn't describe at all. It was suggested ethical statements are more like commands or prescriptions, R.M. Hare, or maybe they're expressions of emotions, A.J. Ayer and Stevenson, or maybe they look as if they're pointing to something objective, but they're really only projections of our own desires or preferences. Simon Blackburn held this, still holds it. Alan Gibbard is another name in that context. Following in the footsteps of Hume, who, of course, said that we have a tendency to spread our mind onto the world. So if they're right, these reductionist accounts, there's nothing very remarkable or transcendent about moral judgments, let alone anything mystical or supernatural. Just quickly consider the game of chicken pull reportedly practiced by the Hopi Indians. The young men of the tribe compete by burying a chicken up to its neck in the ground and then riding by on horseback and seeing who can pull it out of the ground by its neck. And Alan Gibbard, who describes this practice, observes that if you or I had been brought up with a Hopi, we too would have seen nothing wrong with a game that hurts a chicken. But that's no big deal for Gibbard, since there's really for him, no fact of the matter here. There's just, he puts it this way in B, when we use that sentence, it's wrong to hurt chickens. This simply voices a plan to weigh the pain one causes an animal, chickens included, against a certain activity. So these facts about our adoption of plans or our pursuing preferences or projects are going to be very innocuous. They'll fit quite easily into a purely descriptive naturalist account of the world, so they're no big deal. I mean, we decide that hurting the chicken counts against this game. They decide otherwise. End of story. So there are no longer any hostages to the idea that ethics refers to something that transcends, something objective that transcends normal science. Well, in fact, I can't argue this out properly today, but it seems to me that Projectivism is a busted flush, like any attempts to reduce ethics to something non-cognitive, like a command, recommendation, mere expression of preference, project, or passion. They all suffer from a fundamental defect, which is, crudely, they entail that if we changed our preferences or projects, then we'd be inclined to say, or we would say, that the rightness or wrongness had changed. But because there is no objective fact of the matter here, apart from these preferences. But of course, the whole point about ethical truths is that they continue to hold good, even if we don't like them, even if we turn against them, even if they don't fit with our chosen plans. Suppose, as Nietzsche alarmingly suggested in Beyond Good and Evil, he advocates this, that we should steel our hearts against compassion in the name of some grand new project we happen to be pursuing, creativity, self-realization, the will to power. The projectivist has to say that as a result of this subjective shift, this change in our inclinations or preferences, compassion is no longer morally required of us, because we no longer approve of it, we no longer make it part of our project. But I think it's perfectly clear outside the artificial world of the, is the sound okay? The artificial world of the philosophy seminar, that anyone who honestly and sincerely considers such a case knows perfectly well that compassion for the weak and the helpless can never cease to be required. Anyone who thinks otherwise has simply demonstrated they've become corrupt. Or like Nietzsche, perhaps, that their own ego or their own projects have blinded them to moral reality. I mean, unfortunately, for all his brilliance as a philosopher, Nietzsche had a curious blind spot. As Philippa Foot once put it, he lacked the fundamental sense that we're all in the same boat, that sense of human vulnerability. So moving on to 3, objectivity without transcendence. Well, suppose let's just then put on one side all those kinds of projectivist or subjectivist accounts. Suppose you then incline towards objectivism, as an increasing number of moral philosophers now do. Not that that statistic is of any philosophical significance, I guess, but I just refer to it. If you are an objectivist, does that mean you think ethics is transcendent? Well, it seems not, for philosophy departments in the Anglophone world are full of philosophers who consider the moral truths to be objective, but they wouldn't dream of taking what could be called a transcendent conception of ethics in any kind of, in that deep sense I referred to, going somehow beyond, taking us beyond the empirical world. On the contrary, they take what you could call an immanentist stance view of ethics. I can't consider all the options here, but I think among the most promising of recent decades is John McDowell, though he doesn't use the word immanentist. Incidentally, his views, I think, are brilliantly examined by a colleague of mine at Heathrop, Fiona Ellis, in a book that came out last year or the year before called God, Value and Nature. McDowell is quite explicit in his rejection of any notion of the transcendent. That is, he refuses to posit any entities that go beyond the natural world. He calls this rampant Platonism, and for him that's beyond the pale. But at the other end of the spectrum, he also rejects what he calls bald naturalism. That's to say, attempt to reduce all reality to what can be stated in terms of the laws of natural science. For McDowell, there is a middle way, characterized by what he calls the authentic space of reasons, not reducible to a scientific template. It's a space to which we gain access, according to McDowell, through our human conceptual capacities developed over time as our species has evolved. So in addition to what he calls first nature, the world of the particles, properties, events studied by science, physics, biology, there's second nature, which is a complex nexus of moral sensibilities that have arisen through human civilization and culture. We've just developed them over the millennia. So according to McDowell, these are perfectly natural in the sense they were developed out of our ordinary contingent activities as a human species, as a social creature of a certain kind. Hence, they don't require us to posit anything mysterious or transcendent. But, he argues, the sensibilities that we've evolved and developed to have through culture open us up to genuine ethical requirements, genuine ethical realities to which we gain access by being inducted as children into a certain ethical culture. In virtue of this, we do indeed become subject to moral requirements. This is C on the sheet. The rational demands of ethics aren't alien to the contingencies of our life as human beings. Ordinary upbringing can shape the actions and thoughts of human beings in a way that brings these demands into view. Brings them into view, an interesting phrase, it's perfectly objective. We're just able to see them. Well, it's a very subtle and elegant argument, but I think it's ultimately unstable because it has to be understood in terms of one of two ways, neither of which seems to sit comfortably with his world, with McDowell's worldview. The first horn of the dilemma, first way, threatens the objectivity of ethics, which he wants to preserve. The worry here is that the reality of the moral demands to which he's arguing we are genuinely subject is simply, in the end, a function of the contingently evolved characteristics, dispositions, which arise out of a culture with a given contingent developmental history. That's to say, it just has happened that we've developed that way. And because he's so firm in rejecting anything rampant, this rampant Platonism, there can't be any further ultimate moral reality against which we measure our culture. For him, there is no ultimate telos, no objective goal that represents the final purpose of human ethical life. The developmental history of our species, the genealogy of our culture is contingent. It could have been otherwise, and then it seems to follow that if that had been the case, the ethical realities, the demands, would themselves have been different. So we're back to that kind of objection I raised against the Projectivists, though in a different form. Now, of course, there are features of ethics which vary from culture to culture, something Darwin makes great play of in that fantastic book, The Descent of Man. Attitudes to alcohol, to nudity, one can think of lots of examples. But I take it there's no philosophical problems in allowing all sorts of regional and historical variations in such matters. But once we get to certain universal core values, like respect for people's lives and bodies and their, what you might call their personal sphere of control, to say these are contingent becomes profoundly problematic and I think counterintuitive, deeply counterintuitive. You look at G.K. Chesterton, expressed in very florid language in quotation D, but I think there's something in what he's saying. Reason and justice grip the remotest and loneliest star. You can imagine any mad botany or geology you please, forests of adamant with leaves of brilliance, but don't imagine all that frantic astronomy will make the smallest difference to the reason and justice of conduct. On plains of opal under cliffs cut out of pearl, you'd still find a notice, thou shalt not steal. I mean, if you did allow the fundamental imperatives of respect and justice to be alterable, then the objectivity of ethics would be radically undermined. This was something Bernard Williams, I think, reflected on very interestingly when he talked about the radical contingency of the ethical. If the demands which seem to call forth our allegiance are a function of our past history and culture, into which we happen to have been inducted, then the true authority of the ethical evaporates. The morality system, to use a label Bernard Williams used, becomes just what he calls a peculiar institution. That's to say, it's one possible system among many which we might have reason to shake off or change. So that's the first horn of the dilemma against this immanentist approach, the spectre of radical contingency. The second horn is this. A defender of McDowell might say, look, the ethical demands which McDowell is alerting us to are not simply and solely a function of our contingent sensibilities, if that means just our interior psychological propensities. Rather, McDowell, on this alternative view, is saying, look, our human sensibilities are an instrument. They've evolved as an instrument enabling us to perceive genuine, objective ethical reality. I mean, that interpretation of McDowell is suggested by that phrase, bring into view. Sensibilities bring these features into view. Rather like our sensibility or sensitivity to colour, to use an analogy McDowell himself deploys. Colour is if you like, colour perception is a biological evolved faculty, but it does enable us to detect genuine, real properties in things and to discriminate more effectively as we navigate round the world. So on this view, similarly, moral sensibilities may have evolved over time through biology, through culture, but there are still genuine reasons which we become sensitive to in this way, to respect others, for example, to be compassionate to those in need. I think that's probably the best option for defending McDowell's view, but now I think it takes us towards the transcendent, precisely what defenders of this line were trying to avoid. Because the crucial point here is that, as we all know, human culture can take a wrong turn. We only have to think of Nazism or Stalinism or Maoism, not to mention potentially just as sinister examples today. So how do we know they're wrong turns? Not simply by referring to human nature and its needs or desires. Why not? Well, because by any showing we are clearly a conflicted species with a kind of assortment of many different desires and inclinations. As Hume graphically put it, I love quoting this passage, a particle of the dove is kneaded into our frame along with elements of the wolf and the serpent. In other words, it's a mixed bag of qualities. So why should any one of them, of all the turns which humans might take, why should any one of them, any one cultural tradition, be supposed to give us access to the objectively right answer? I don't think, and I'm trying to argue that we can't answer that question if we stay entirely within the immanent frame, the world of human history and culture. For moral demands properly understood are not just one set of reasons among many possible sets that compete for our attention. They are a touchstone, something that calls forth our allegiance, even when, as so often, we fail to pay heed to it. So if the idea of authentic moral authority is to survive, we need something objective that stands over against this evolved mix of propensities, this amalgam of properties. Something, in other words, that transcends them. For without some such touchstone, there seems no basis of, as it were, pinning a gold star in any one of these conflicting impulses and regarding it as having normative force. So I must speed up a little bit, moving quickly on to 4, transcendence without theism. you might say, well, okay, we'll accept some kind of objective authority, but that doesn't lead us to theism. Why not just say that moral properties are non-natural properties and leave it at that? Now, there are many sophisticated versions of this around nowadays, and the worry McDowell had about these things is that they introduced non-natural properties, introduced what he calls rampant Platonism. You know, sort of there they are, and alongside the natural properties of science. There are many non-naturalists around, though. One is Eric Wielenberg, who says, moral properties constitute the ethical background of every possible universe. Maybe that latter phrase, bringing it into the realm of every possible, kind of suggests an analogy with mathematical truths or logical truths, kind of abstract truths which kind of, just like mathematical truths, they're there waiting to be investigated, but we don't have to locate them, as it were, in the physical world. But I'm not sure that analogy really helps, because if there are these ultimate logical and mathematical truths, and there are these ethical truths, then that's a remarkable fact about reality, which we need to somehow take account of, seems to me, saying, oh, we've got the mathematical ones already, so why not let's have the moral ones? It doesn't seem to me to be an explanation. And particularly if you look at a non-naturalist like Russ Schaffer-Landau, E., we humans have created for ourselves a number of different sets of conventional moral standards, but these are never the final word. The flaws and attractions of any conventional morality are rightly measured against a moral system human beings didn't create. Now, I agree with that, but now the distance between that and a theistic view seems vanishingly small, because you're saying the cosmos, the universe, reality is such that there are these ethical demands. It's a very strange cosmos in that case, much stranger than is normally thought by those who consider themselves to be broadly in line with the non-theistic consensus. I mean, some have argued we can just sort of ignore this question or cut the Gordian knot. This is 5, Parfit, who's very clear in his latest book that morality has an authoritative status. He totally accepts moral objectivism, but rather like St. Augustine before he converted, he thinks he can have that as sort of perhaps not a Platonistic view, but he can have some kind of objectivism without theism. Now, he's adamant, Parfit, about the objectivity of these truths. Some things really matter. The title of his book suggests that. How we treat people really matters. How we look after our planet really matters. And Parfit says this: in believing some things matter, I am believing there are irreducibly normative truths. This word normative is, I think, not an entirely satisfactory one. But what it means is there's some moral truths that have objective authority over us. Or they give us decisive reason to act, decisive overriding reason to act in certain ways. But what grounds this objectivity? And Parfit's, I think, curious answer is nothing does. This is F, like numbers and logical truths, that parallel there with mathematics and logic again. Normative properties and truths have no ontological status. For such claims to be true, the reason involving properties need not exist, either as natural properties in the spatio-temporal world or in some non-spatio-temporal part of reality. So he's rejecting any Platonistic conception or theistic conception there. Well, that kind of ontological nihilism about what grounds these truths seems to me just bizarre. But maybe I'm just seeing a difficulty. I mean, you've just got to have these truths which are true as true can be, as he says somewhere, but nothing makes them true. I think we did start a little late, didn't we? But we need to have
What I was going to suggest was we'll have a question session go on a bit later, and if anyone needs to slip out, they'll be able to.
Okay.
But do take as much
Yes.
notice.
Well, I've nearly finished, but I've just got two very short sections to go. Why stop short of theism, section 6. Many people, I think, are strongly attracted to moral objectivism, but resist at all costs the final step to theism. Nagel is perhaps the most striking example, G1, who says in the last word, which wasn't his last word, but by any means, I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. A strange comment.Maybe the thought is that that would be a threat to our autonomy and independence as rational creatures. Although, of course, sovereignty and independence, I think, are largely fantasies anyway, since if anything's clear about human beings, it's clear that we're not self-creating entities. But so it may be that's worrying him, or it may be, which is often wheeled in as a standard objection at this point, the so-called Euthyphro problem, which is if we just very crudely, if we introduce God, there's no way whereby his commanding something could make it right. And this is often thought about to be a knockdown objection to positing God as the source of morality. Well, many theists, including myself, would agree that a command, even issued by a supremely powerful being, could not in itself have normative force. No sensible theist, in my view, could think a mere order does the job. But quite a lot of people have Robert Adams is perhaps the best example, the most sophisticated example, have argued that the respect owed to God's commands doesn't hinge on just his ordering things, but on the fact that the issuer of the command is supremely loving, merciful, and just. Now, invoking those qualities might seem to raise another, this is the other horn of the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. Mere commands won't do the job, but if you say they're the commands of a good and just creator, then that won't do the job either, because that makes it circular. You're appealing to the goodness of God, and that's what we're supposed to be, or the justice, and that's what we are supposed to be explaining in the first place. I'm prepared to bite the bullet or accept that horn of the dilemma, because I think, as with many aspects of theism, it doesn't really, it's not supposed to be explanatory in that way. It's not supposed to provide a kind of further explanation for the existence of the world, or for the ultimate nature of morality, or for the grounding of morality. And you might say, well, if it's not explanatory, what's it doing? Well, I think the answer is it's providing a framework of interpretation, a system of coordinates, as Wittgenstein once put it. But it presents us, if to put it another way, with a picture of the cosmos in which the idea of authoritative demands are at home in a way they weren't before, because things like requirements and demands, incidentally similarly to logic, to the requirements of logic, are things we really make sense of best within a personal framework. We don't make sense of them within a domain where they're just particles hitting other particles. So a picture of the universe that's grounded in transcendent personal terms is a picture where the idea of a moral demand and a moral authority somehow fits in ways which it doesn't fit if we take a purely Darwinian or materialist or physicalist account of the development, of the nature and development of the cosmos. To say just a tiny bit more about that, the idea here that I think follows once you introduce God is teleology, the idea of the cosmos ordered teleologically towards an end which is good. There is, if you like, a governing normative destination to the cosmos. And I think on that broad picture, moral demands fit in ways which we can't see how they could fit, certainly on the naturalist picture, nor on this strange picture where they're just these truths which we just hanging around somewhere. Or maybe they're not hanging around anywhere, they just are true. So if there is divine teleology at work in the cosmos, or structuring the cosmos, then there will, among our mixed bag of, going back to this earlier argument, among our mixed bag of human potentialities, there will be one which points us towards the destiny where our ultimate fulfillment lies. So, for example, the demand to love our fellow creatures will be ultimately grounded in this teleological structure of the cosmos, of reality. If the pattern according to which we're created allows true fulfillment only if the love that is within us overflows out towards our fellow creatures, for example, then we'll have the highest, most compelling reason to live in accordance with that principle. It will be that towards which we're destined to find our fulfillment. It's quite difficult to make this idea of a moral teleology more explicit than that, I think. So what I think is suggested here is that the theistic picture provides a unified interpretation of the way in which moral obligations are, as it were, cosmically grounded. Let me finally, in section 7, come back to this trio I started with: transcendent, supernatural, mysterious. Well, as far as transcendence is concerned, I hope I've said enough to suggest that whether or not you believe in God, there are good reasons to regard the domain of morality as going beyond, transcending in that sense, the world of nature, first nature, the world of physical science. And I think there are also, as I've suggested, good reasons to think it transcends second nature, the world of our evolved capacities and culturally trained dispositions. So in that sense, I think we can see the point of Wittgenstein's remark that ethics is transcendent. And I would add that for the theist, this transcendence is a kind of sign that points us not by a logical demonstration, but by a kind of hermeneutical invitation to see the ethical demand as stemming from the transcendent source of morality that's God. Second, is it supernatural? Well, in a loose sense, yes. Going beyond or above first nature or second nature, so in that sense, supernatural. But I don't actually like the term supernatural very much. It seems to me it's a kind of blank, it's a placeholder, rather like God, saying God is immaterial. It actually tells us nothing about the item so described. I personally find it unhelpful, sorry, Freudian slip there, unhelpful to say that God is supernatural. It suggests a kind of Cartesian ghost or disembodied spirit. I mean, I know there are very eminent philosophers of religion who defend that view. But the more troubling reason is that nature is a very ambiguous term, often used in a very restricted sense nowadays to be roughly synonymous with the empirical. But nature, with a capital N, as it was used in the Middle Ages and really right up until the early modern period, nature is the divine, for example in Descartes, is the divinely created world, the world shot through with meaning and value. So God is the ultimate source of nature in this rich sense. And in him, as St. Paul put it, we live and move and have our being. So our principal understanding of God for the theist is through nature, through the natural world. And through, in particular, those value properties which we detect in the world we inhabit, values like beauty and also the moral values. So the natural world is, as Gerard Manley Hopkins famously put it, charged with the grandeur of God. So to label God supernatural is to risk removing him from the very manifestation of the sacred here in the natural world, which is one of our most important modes of access to the divine. And finally, what about mystical or mysterious? In one way, ethics is utterly unmysterious. I mean, there could be nothing less mysterious than you shall not steal, or you ought not to steal. It's not a mystical sentence in that sense, in a linguistic sense. But the mystery comes, I think, in the nature of the demand, that strange, compelling authority of the moral. I think it wasn't any mere whimsy that led Kant in that famous passage to refer to the starry heavens above and the moral law within as the two things that generate awe, Achtung. And as someone thoroughly familiar with the Bible, he would have had clearly in mind the thought in Psalm 19, which begins with the heavens declare the glory of God, and goes on in the second, transitions almost seamlessly in the second half to refer to the moral law, the Torah, more precious than gold, sweeter than honey and the honeycomb, end of quote. And there is something mysterious about this because, as perhaps I've laboured, there's nothing in this mixture of qualities we have, the ill-assorted bricolage of powers and instincts, as Bernard Williams once called it, that could justify the belief that our consciousness has evolved into an instrument of transcendence. In Thomas Nagel's phrase, just end with that G2, this is since the last word he's in the Mind and Cosmos 2012, it started to become very clear that the mind, however it developed, has evolved into an instrument of transcendence that can grasp objective meaning and objective value. And that remarkable fact about us, I think, connects with what I've been arguing today, that the imperatives of love and of justice call forth a response from us that we can't in integrity deny. A response that requires us to transcend ourselves and reach beyond the debris of our cultural and biological inheritance to the true destination, the true telos, where our peace and fulfillment lies.
Thank you, John, for that characteristically rich talk. We now have around 20 minutes for questions. As I said before, if you'd wait for Mikolai to bring you the microphone before you ask a question so it can be picked up from the camera, we'd be very grateful.
Yeah, thanks, John. That was great. Just on the last point about Nagel in Mind and Cosmos, in that book I sense that he's flirting with teleology himself. And it's a teleology that allows for the existence of mind. And if you extend that to his moral realism, I think you can extend mind there as being the existence of a thing which is sensitive to reasons or something like that. But his claim in that book for not wishing to invoke a supernatural entity, God, is that he thinks it would necessarily lead to a dualistic picture that he's hoping to avoid. And I just wondered if you could pass any comment on that, because I don't seem to think that's a necessary entailment of invoking God to provide that teleology that he's trying to not explicitly mention, but certainly flirting with in that book.
Yes. I mean, in a way, thank you, that's a very interesting question. In a way, I think he wants to have his cake and eat it. He thinks there's something wrong with the current scientific consensus. I mean, he thinks he just can't explain through random mutation and natural selection how our minds evolved in this, how our minds got to be these instruments of transcendence. But he wants to limit that transcendence to something which is still broadly compatible with the physicalist world picture, although in some way it'll have teleology added into it. So I think it's just a sketch of, as it stands at the moment, of one way he sort of would like science to go, an enriched kind of science. But there are two issues there. The dualist, I mean, I haven't got into this in the paper, but I personally think Malebranche was right when he said it's not really very helpful to think of a God as a mind any more than to think of him as a body. These categories don't really solve anything. And any plausible picture of the divine creativity will be that it's poured forth in the natural world, as I was hinting at the end. So if that's his reason, I think ultimately it could be unpicked. And the teleology he has in mind, I mean, it's a very special kind of teleology we're thinking in here, really. It's not the way we're actually going. It's not that, the oak tree, the acorn happens to grow into the oak tree, that's its, as it were. It's more a normative teleology. It's the way we as Paul puts it, we're groaning in travail because we know where we should go, but we often don't. So it's the pull of the normative, which is not quite the same as teleology in a biological sense, that some things have natural developmental paths. But it's something which, to my mind, no philosopher has properly sorted out yet. Exactly how we construe that kind of teleology that I think theism is bound up with in some way.
We had a second question here, and then my one.
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Clearly, for someone who thinks that there is a God from whom all things come, then sufficient reflection on the way things are can help one come to a knowledge of the source of all things. But that kind of entailment might have many steps, and among many philosophers has taken a long time, so that people can even if A or B implies C, entails C, let alone entails Z, you might say. That doesn't mean to say that one can't have a grasp of A and B and the truth of A and B without realizing that they entail X, Y, Z. And also that one can reasonably criticize false views and see that there are true views which are distinct from them without realizing the entailment of those ultimately in terms of God. So that somebody could say, could see that with regards to natural truths, that reason, there's a kind of transcendence about reason in that in this sort of post-truth politics that we have these days, for a scientist to hold out in saying that they should criticize things according to canons of reason and not what's politically expedient, is a scientific moral imperative, which is to do with the fulfillment of the mind and as it were the meaning of the mind. And somebody might understand that without understanding that this ultimately leads to God.
Absolutely, I think that's quite right. Clearly, one can perceive a flash of lightning without perceiving it under the description electrical discharge. So it may, and I think this point applies to many things. Some of the new atheists, notably Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens towards the end of his life, said, we really should have accepted that there is such a thing as the sacred, the numinous, because these spiritual experiences, otherwise they've taken on board spiritual experiences, saying these are some of the most transformative and important of our lives, but we can have these as atheists. Now, it would be silly, very silly for a theist to say anyone who has you can only have a spiritual experience if you're a believer. I mean, clearly human beings have spiritual experiences whether or not. But I think what the theist ultimately will want to say is that to have such experiences of the beauty of the natural world, of the moral law and its requirements, is to perceive the divine, though not necessarily under that description, picking up your point. Yeah.
So I enjoyed the talk a great deal, and I was inclined to agree with most of what you said. However, at first I wanted to press you on one point, and it's changed slightly in the discussion. So we got to the point where there are people who think that morality is objective but has no grounds. So this was the position you attributed to Parfit, and there are other people who have taken this view, describing moral truths as having non-ontological being and other such contradictions. So I can utterly understand why we'd want it to have some kind of ground. But then the question is, well, do we need theism? Or as you put it on the handout, why stop short of theism? Now, the obvious answer would be because the only ground available is going to be God, or something like that, which was what I was expecting you to say. However, when you came to talking about God, you said the opposite, that this isn't supposed to supply a ground. Now, the only way I can see this as making sense is if the thought is, it does have a ground, we have to posit that, but in going further to God, we're not adding a ground, we're just giving a view of what kind of ground it is we've already posited. We need a personal understanding of it. So my main question was, is that the way we should understand this? My sub-question which came up here was that, what people are resistant to, I think probably is the personal nature of God, rather than, or at least many people, rather than some kind of impersonal ground. But if it is going to be a personal ground, doesn't it have to have a mind, because persons are minds? And in that case, how do you get away from something that sounds rather Cartesian, unless you say something like, well, it's got a body too, which doesn't obviously sound attractive? I'll pass the mic over for your answer.
Well, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. The reason I added that it won't function as an explanation, I don't think it necessarily follows that it's not a ground in some sense. But the reason it doesn't function as an explanation, I think, is similar to that which Plato pointed out a long, long time ago with the third man argument. If you posit the form of the good and say what makes things good is their participation in the form of the good, you haven't really explained goodness, because the form of the good itself has the property you're supposed to be explaining. I take that to be a valid argument against thinking the forms have explanatory force in that sense. Nonetheless, Plato, a Platonist, I think, can plausibly say that the forms do somehow ground the particulars in the world. But now, in the case of normative properties, it's not clear how the form of the good could carry the requisite authority. We could contemplate it, but then we could say, well, I've contemplated that, now I'm going to contemplate something else. So the idea of something seizing us, requiring a response from us, seems to be something that makes sense within the domain of the personal, in ways in which a merely existing form to be contemplated, like the sun in the sky, to use an analogy Plato himself used, wouldn't have the requisite normative pull. So that's moved a bit beyond the question of explanation. But I think I'm happy to take your suggestion that we're looking for a certain kind of ground, namely, and we identify that ground as God. I just want to add the rider that that's not supposed to function as an explanation, a sort of a non-circular explanation. So someone, and perhaps I'm being too modest, too reticent in that respect. Maybe we should say, no, theism is an explanation. But then the way you put it suggests there might be a deductive argument or an argument by elimination for the existence of God as the only remaining candidate. And
that's what I was hoping for. Yeah.
Yes. Perhaps this is, perhaps I'm being unnecessarily cautious here, but to use a phrase of Nagel, I don't want God to be deductively provable in that way. To use an idea of Nagel.
And on the question of him having a mind, or does he have a mind?
You have a mind, yes. I mean, so...
Not me, God.
No, but
it's easy mistake to make.
I think God has to be the category of the personal, fall into that category. But when the sort of view that, say, Richard Swinburne has, he's a person just like you and me, except he doesn't happen to have a body, that doesn't seem to me to do very much. The picture of the idea of a disembodied person. Well,
I'd like to push you on it, but perhaps
yes. I mean, maybe this is a contradiction in but it is the subject for another paper, I think. And of course, there are those like Anthony Kenny who think that's a fatal flaw in theism, the idea of that you're extracting person from the domain where it makes sense. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Professor, thank you for the talk. You've made me very much aware that you're a man, and your two associates are also men. There are 6 ladies in this audience. Each one of them would be conscious that they can, within their own bodies, there can be ignited what you call the spark of consciousness, and they will be required to bear it to a fruition, possibly of transcendence. This matters to me. Do you suppose that Mary was required to tell the little boy Jesus that he was the Son of God? Or do you suppose that Jesus didn't need to be told and knew it anyway? In other words, I want to wonder what you suppose a woman would understand as transcendence. That's my question.
I don't think... it seems to me that this understanding of transcendence is something which to be human is to know that one is limited, one is finite. And as Descartes argued in the third meditation, in knowing that very fact of our finitude, we are implicitly aware that we fall short of something than which we infinitely fall short. So to be a human being is this strange paradox. We know we're limited, and yet we have this sense of the infinite, of the unlimited. And I don't think that's gender related. I think that's something that's part of our common humanity, and which is, Descartes thought it led to us almost to a deductive argument for God's existence. But my own view of that third meditation is more like that of Levinas. I think what's really described as an encounter of the finite with the infinite, which I suppose you could say, I mean, this isn't a theological talk, I suppose you could say in theological terms that that's what happened in the incarnation. The finite human woman encountered the infinite.
I'm afraid we'll have to keep it to one question per questioner, because we have a final one on the corner here. Just this
Okay. Thanks for the talk. You may have come across Stephen Law, who's a philosopher in London. Oh, is he? All right. Okay. Well, then you definitely would. In a debate, I noticed he came up with an argument about the transcendent possibly being an evil god. And as in, how could we know the transcendent is not ultimately aiming towards a evil end rather than a good end? So I was just wondering what your response to that would be. What would you think about that particular argument he's made, if you know it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, again, the traditional theological answer is that we move beyond the mathematical infinite and these other notions of just something which is greater than we can grasp, to the absolute infinite, which would, as Descartes put it again, would include absolutely all perfections of which we can have an idea. So it would make no sense to think of this being as just very powerful, for example, but lacking the perfection of goodness. And there are, I'm not a theologian, but there are arguments for this. For example, that malice implies some defect. If I want to do you down, that implies that I'm jealous of you, or I got some issue I haven't resolved, and so that implies a defect in me. But if I was perfect, then I wouldn't have these malicious. There would be no reason for them. So if I was both, so power and perfection carry with them goodness. I think I'm happy to accept that traditional notion, which is that God is the, well, of course, the classic theistic position is that he's perfectly simple. So you can't really separate out these properties at all. But if per impossibile you could separate them, then you'd see that the one implies the other.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we have run out of time for questions. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this talk. I would like to remind you that there are further talks in this year's IRC HPP series. That's the academic year, of course, 2016 to 17. Coming up next term, and you'll be able to find out information on them on our websites, the Humane Philosophy Project website and the Ian Ramsey Centre's one, and we hope to see you all there. But if you could please just give one more round of applause for Professor John Cottingham.